Sir Desmond Stirling in the Tell-Tale Nipple, Episode 2. I was surprised how readily that the club president granted permission for my ghost hunting. Naturally, he demanded that I promise not to write about my mission, and equally naturally I lied and said I wouldn't. My club, Aberdone's, is notoriously publicity shy, always guaranteeing sanctuary from the real world for the reprobates who comprise the membership. But losing the use of a room due to the superstitions of its simpleton staff must have rankled. So if I could clear up the enigma one way or the other, they could claim this as a good result. I might even get free life membership, if the upshot is to their liking. A date was set for my night of ghostly vigil. I had hoped that Frognall would join me as an unbiased observer, but his lack of membership prohibited him, and the committee refused to sanction any relaxation of rules to allow him to take part. Another stipulation, with which I heartily agreed, was that no other member should know of my vigil. I didn't want any of the rotters to play any tricks and scupper the serious scientific nature of my investigation. I chose as my date the 14th of February. I knew that on this night most of the members would be absent, being forced to take their wives, mistresses, boyfriends, favourite tarts, and sundry significant others out for some kind of romantic occasion. It was also, I discovered from my research, the anniversary of the day that Sir Jasper de Scornley was unceremoniously booted out of the club. If his spook was holding a grudge, then surely that of all days would be when he would most likely manifest himself. I went shopping for the apparatus I would need for my evening of ghost hunting. Candles, some holy water, an infrared camera, a cracking bottle of Glenniskinnock whisky, a notepad, and a pen. As the planned evening approached, my sense of anticipation tautened. I'm not easily frightened. I once parachuted into Germany dressed as a nun. It wasn't the war. I'd just lost a bet with the Duke of Edinburgh. But my pulse quickened when I thought of the night ahead. I'd often unmasked those who were pretending to be ghosts, most recently my ex-wife and her girlfriend Pam at my alma mater Scar-Hill Death Hall, but I was unprepared for what to do if the spooky rogue I encountered was the real McCoy. Would I keep my nerve? Or would I succumb to the heebie-jeebies like Scunthorpe had? It seemed unlikely for a war hero such as myself, trained in the art of death by combat, to go jelly-kneed at the sight of a ghost. But even the most lion-hearted of fellows has been known to bespoil their trousers when caught unawares. Perhaps I ought to doff the clothes and go knackers akimbo during my vigil. Could be a bit chilly in the box room, and besides, one can be a tad vulnerable in such a state of sans-truths. The feast of St. Valentine's dawned. I spent the day preparing for my long night of supernatural vigil. I had a splendid 5-course lunch, snoozed most of the afternoon, then supped in my club, followed by a brandy or two. The place was pleasingly quiet. I chuckled at the thought of my fellow members having to endure a mandatory romantic evening with their trouble and strifes, followed by a duty knee-trembler. I did worry about whether old Chinny Chapman was in any fit state to indulge in carnal congress, but then recalled that his wife had run off with the bus driver a year or two before, so he was excused the tedium of Valentine's Day. In fact, I spotted him fast asleep in the club lounge, his pipe dangling precariously from his drooping mouth. I wondered how Snotty Gove was spending the evening. I couldn't imagine him in any kind of romantic or erotic circumstances. But for every foot there's a sock, as my old nanny used to say, although in the case of Snotty's pater there's a somewhat redundant sock. The clock struck. 10 p.m. Time to start. I'd been given the keys to the box room earlier. Scunthorpe handed them over very reluctantly and had pleaded with me to drop my investigation. I'd been very firm with him, even suggesting he join me in my vigil to face his fears. He shook his head in dismay and scuttled off to wherever minions go. It didn't surprise me to find him off duty that evening. He never took time off, but he was in such a funk that he'd fled the building. I wondered where he went on his free time. He was such a part of the fabric of the club that I couldn't envisage him existing in the outside world. He probably went to the pictures or maybe something saucier. Like all good club staff, he had an encyclopedic knowledge of the local tarts and their specialities, and could always recommend the right person, whatever the required fetish. Maybe he was owed some commission. I climbed the stairs to the box room. I wasn't feeling my usual tingle of anticipation before an adventure. Rather, I was aware of a gnawing in the pit of my gut, although that could have been the spotted dick. I reached the door to the box room. Now that I was aware of it, I couldn't see how I'd missed it so many times, as I trekked to the roof for my nude sunbathing. I fumbled for the keys, and I placed the Yale in the lock. Who was that? I definitely heard that, didn't I? I stared around, but there wasn't a fellow in the vicinity. I withdrew the key. Did I really want to do this? Wasn't it a foolish way to spend the night, when there was a very comfortable armchair downstairs with easy access to unlimited booze? I shook my head. What was I thinking? Old Stirling had never chickened out of anything before. There could be a best-selling book out of this. The Rolls needed a new gearbox, and my latest installment of the Derrick Playfair adventures, a guaranteed money spinner, had stalled somewhat in my brain. I quickly turned the key in its lock and opened the door. I entered the allegedly haunted box room. The air was stale, reeking of dust and damp. I fumbled for a light switch, but all my hand encountered was a cobweb. I dug out the torch from my bag and switched it on. The beam was powerful but limited. It illuminated a narrow strip of the room, revealing fragments of furniture. I brought along a large supply of candles and holders. I lit a brace of them in the corridor, then took them in. The flickering luminance didn't enhance the room's welcoming atmosphere, but I placed the candles on a heavy wooden chest of drawers, then quickly ignited another pair. I now had ample light by which to examine the box room more thoroughly. It was a small room, sparsely furnished. The aforementioned chest, a single bed, and a rocking chair. The wallpaper was dark and cheerless. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, thick enough to be mistaken for lace curtains, in which large spiders scuttled away as they were hit by the light from the candles. There was no window. I sighed. Not the most comfortable of rooms in which to spend a night. I tentatively patted the bed. A cloud of dust mushroomed up, enveloping me and triggering a coughing fit. Perhaps if I stripped the bed of its sheets, maybe the mattress itself would be less grimy. I grabbed the eiderdown and tugged, but it disintegrated in my hand. I was beginning to wonder if I should have tried bribing the less nervous members of the cleaning staff to have given the room a quick once-over before attempting my vigil. Oh well, too late now. I would have to share my night with the dust mites, the spiders, and who knew what else. My mighty imagination had been a boon for me most of my life. My many best-selling novels sprouted from it, and it has been the source of the comfortable lifestyle which I have enjoyed since I first put nib to parchment. But it has a downside. Whereas the man in the Clapham omnibus looks at a shadow and merely sees an absence of light, we scribes see a black abyss of the unknown, in which all manners of beastliness writhe and breed in their horror. I pride myself on being firmly in control of my imagination, never succumbing to the vapours which women and other feeble creatures succumb. But I cannot tell a lie. This room induced a queer uneasiness in me. I brought my bag in the room and shut the door. To make the room a tad less chez le gossy, I lit a few more candles, but even the extra lumens didn't improve the ambience, merely added more shadows. A couple of whiskies and I wouldn't even notice the unpleasantness, I told myself. I unpacked what I'd need for my bag, lugged the rocking chair to a corner of the room from which I could survey it all, and settled down. The chair creaked as I sat, and the rocking motion was abrupt. I felt as though I could easily tip backwards all the way to the floor. I resolved to find something to jam under the rockers to keep it still. A vision of the jolly, cosy bedroom 2 stories below popped into my head, the one in which I often stayed when I didn't want to traipse back to the old rectory late at night, usually because I was somewhat newt-like. I gave myself a good finger-wagging. This night had the potential to be an adventure, a lucrative one, what's more. Not something that the Stirling of old would have balked at. The Stirling that fought in the war, the Stirling that once wrestled an ostrich, the Stirling that had laughed when faced with a firing squad comprising Bolivian Satanists, the Stirling who had marched through central London at the front of the Nudist Pride March, even the Stirling that had given the correct definition of frottage on Call My Bluff. As I gingerly settled back in my rocking chair, my wedged foot preventing me from ending up unnecessarily horizontal, I surveyed the room again by torchlight, which is when I noticed the portrait. It hung over the mantelpiece, which topped a blocked-up fireplace, competently painted, but no forgotten masterpiece. It depicted a young cove, floridly dressed in mid-18th century clobber, quite handsome, his expression spoiled by a supercilious air, the mouth twisted in a cruel sneer. But the eyes. One jokes about the eyes of a portrait following one around the room, but these seemed almost alive. I truly felt they were staring right at me. No, right into me, piercing my own eyes to read my thoughts, perhaps even my very soul itself. Did this painting depict Sir Jasper de Scornley? Had this been his bedroom back in the day? This was more like a servant's quarters, but perhaps it was where he indulged his more outre carnal romps. Not that he struck me as a chap who had any qualms about keeping his peccadilloes quiet. And if the painting were of he, then his roguish reputation seems to have been vindicated. Frankly, I wasn't spending the night being stared at by this wretched painting, so I turned it around so all I could see was the back of the frame. Doing this disturbed remarkably little dust, which, surprisingly for a man of my forensic astuteness, didn't strike me as at all odd. I returned to the rocking chair and wondered how I was going to spend the long night ahead. I took a swig from my hip flask, contemplated making some notes, and next thing I knew I was fast asleep. with a start from a deep but dreamless snooze. For a moment I hadn't the foggiest idea of where I was, but as soon as the brain clicked into place, I remembered. I fumbled for my watch. Was it nearly morning? Could I leave this unpleasant little room and go back to my own bed? 1:17 a.m. Damn. I rather fancied a hot, milky drink. A posset with plenty of nutmeg and rum. But I doubted that the night porter would traipse all the way up here with one, even if I had any means to contact him. I'd have to make do with another swig of whiskey. I threw back my head to glug the warming nectar down my throat, when I noticed the portrait had been turned back the right way. Those blasted eyes were staring at me again, and the cruel smirk seemed even more disdainful than before. I snapped myself wide awake. I contemplated my next strategy. There were two possibilities. Either someone had come into the room while I was asleep, or something supernatural was afoot. I was sceptical about the latter, which meant the former was more likely. A chilling prospect. Who could it have been? I cursed myself for not locking the door. I hadn't even shut it properly, leaving it slightly ajar in case... Well, just in case. I examined the portrait again. The face almost seemed familiar. But frankly, I've spent many a weekend in a chum's country estate, and the place is a chock-a-block with similar paintings. And all the subjects, no matter which house, all look as though they're all related. Knowing our aristocracy, they probably are. I nicked more whiskey and put the hip flask on the mantelpiece. I went to the door, closed it firmly, and locked it. I didn't relish the idea of being locked in. After all, the first rule of warfare is keep an option for a tactical retreat. But neither did I want anyone sneaking up on me. I tried the door to make sure it was firmly locked. On my way back to the rocking chair, I reached for my hip flask. It was gone. Sir Desmond Stirling, in the Tell-Tale Nipple, was written and performed by Anthony Keetch.